Today, we're going to take a look at the decolonization movements that happened throughout the world from the end of the 1940s, pretty much up until the 1960s, 1970s. And we're going to be looking at places mainly in Africa, a little bit in the Middle East, and then also South and Southeast Asia. Now, to start with, we need to know why this decolonization movement happens, and it's mainly because of a surge of colonial nationalism or anti-colonial nationalism, where the colonies want to become their own countries. They realize they're united through a common ethnicity, and that they want to rule themselves instead of being controlled by someone else. And so there are three patterns this can take. One is a civil war, where the people break away. This is more like what we see in Latin America and the 13 colonies in Haiti during the 1700s and 1800s when they break away. Then you have negotiated independence movements where the two sides come together, the colonies and the parent countries, and they talk and discuss timelines for when they're going to gain their independence and go through that process. These are countries like Ghana and India. And then we have incomplete decolonization, where the Europeans say you'll have some autonomy, but you're not going to get it fully, like in Algeria and Vietnam. But this doesn't really work out, and so the people of the colonies start fighting against, and then they get their independence by kind of forcibly breaking away. But I would not say it's the same as kind of that civil war there. Okay. Now, the keys to why this movement happens. First off, it is a contradiction between the European values and what they do at home and what they do in the colonies. And the Africans see this. The Africans participate in the world wars, especially World War II, where over 200,000 fight in Europe for the Europeans. And they go, wait, there's kind of a hypocrisy here. You're saying that people should have freedom and liberty and equality and all these things, but you beat us down and you don't let us have any say in anything. So they realize that and start fighting against it. And at this time, the Europeans are recovering after World War II because they've been now in the Second World War in the last 30 years or so, and it's not good for business. And they don't have the power to come down and just bash down the rebellion, and so they have to kind of work with them. At the same time that that's going on, there's also a new wave of Pan-African and Pan-Arabism, where the Africans see themselves as actually a group of people that all have a similar heritage and should be united, and so they start fighting to become their own united Africa, which won't exactly happen, but they start pressing for that, and we now have something that's similar to this called the African Union, which brings a lot of the African countries together, but that will happen much later on. And then we have Pan-Arabism, where the Arab countries want to kind of come together as their own set of countries, or their own country, but it doesn't exactly happen like that either. But there's that push for that in both these areas, where they all kind of unite in trying to push against their colonizing countries. You also have three groups looking to end this. You have the United Nations, which says colonialism is not the best thing to do to countries, and is maybe something that shouldn't happen. You have the U.S., who says, no, you shouldn't have colonies. Everyone should be able to make their own decisions. And you have the Soviet Union saying the same thing. Now, the U.S. and Soviet Union are saying this because they want to be able to influence those colonies, which they can't do if they are colonies of a parent country. But they also do kind of believe in the values that are put forth of Europe, and saying they should have equality, freedom, and all those things. The last bit that's going on is some empires are switching and becoming organizing themselves differently, to where they don't have direct control over of the people or of that colony. This is mainly Britain when we talk about this, and their establishment of going from an empire to a commonwealth, where they will kind of pledge allegiance to the monarch or say they are loyal to that monarch, but they get all the freedom of being their own independent country. And this is kind of what we talk about with Canada, Australia, and New Zealand here. Those are kind of three of the major Commonwealth countries that say, hey, we have allegiance to the British Queen right now, Queen Elizabeth II, but it doesn't really mean anything. They get to do their own things and get to go their own way. Britain does not have any control over them, other than they get to choose who the next monarch is. Okay. Now, here's a map of the decolonization process and which countries get their freedom when. And so you can see a lot of this is happening if you look through Africa in the 1950s and 60s. There are a few that will take place until, or go until 1975, 74. But for the most part, by the 50s and definitely by the end of the 60s, most of Africa is its own country. And then if we look at the South Asia, you got India, Pakistan, they all get their freedom at the same time. And then you have Southeast Asia with Vietnam getting their independence, and Laos and Cambodia and those regions getting their own independence around the 50s or so, right after shortly after World War II. Now we're going to start looking at Africa here, and we'll start with Algeria, which we've taken a little bit of a look at, but just kind of as a recap here, the Algerians after World War II want their independence, and they ask France to give it to them, and France goes, "Heck no, no, you're not a colony. You're actually our property, and we'll give you voice in government." And the Algerians say, "That's nice, but no, we want to be free." And so the Algerians start fighting against the French, and the French come back and bring in 400,000 troops to try to put them down. And it kind of works, but the French realize that this is maybe not the best course of action to do, and it might not be sustainable over a long term. And so in the 50s, the French reorganized their government, created a new republic, and create the Fifth Republic. And they give the Algerians the choice: do you want to be your own country or not? And the Algerians vote on that in 1962, and they say, we want to be our own country, and so they become their own country. Then, if we go down to West Africa, West Africa has been kind of, North Africa has had the most interaction with the Europeans, because that goes all the way back to Rome and even before then. But West Africa, with the modern Europeans, has had the second most interaction with the Europeans, or the most since the 1400s or so, with the Portuguese starting to land and make ports along that on their travel to the Indian Ocean. And so they're the most westernized of these colonies, and they, for the most part, take gradual transitions to independence, some different from what happens with Algeria, where there's some fighting that's needed. And so they work at times there's some violent revolutions that happen, but they work with their European counterparts and slowly transition. And the best example of this is Ghana, which in 1957 gained its independence, and they were led by a guy named Kwame Nkrumah, who wants Ghana to become independent and become a democracy, but also is one of the major figures for Pan-Africanism during the time. And he really fights for all of Africa to become independent and then to unite under kind of a United States of Africa model. Unfortunately for him, though, after a few years of leading Ghana, there's a military coup that takes him out, pushes him out of politics, and so him and his push for that kind of ends there. But again, there has been maybe a little bit of a resurgence in that, or that's always kind of around in Africa, that they want to become united and work together more. And so that's why there's an organization called the African Union, which is similar to the European Union in that it unites several of the African countries to come together and help each other out through times of need and struggle. So that's West Africa and Ghana. And then you have Congo. This is moving to Central Africa now. And Central Africa is probably the least prepared area for these independence movements, because they haven't been modernized. They haven't had as much of contact with the Europeans. Definitely not the 500 years worth that West Africa has had. And so what happens is they try to gain their independence, but it usually is kind of shaky, especially when we talk about the Congo, where there wasn't a lot of education. The infrastructure was not there to connect the whole country very well, and there's very little industrialization going on there. And so that process was supposed to take 30 years. Instead, it took 4 years, and if you can guess, probably not too good. And so, or not too good in preparing them for their independence. The Belgians just kind of said, hey, have fun. And so Patrice Lumumba takes over, and he tries to modernize the Congo, tries to set up a solid government. However, there are problems. The region of Katanga here in the southeast corner of the Congo wants to break away and go back with Belgium, and he says, no, you cannot do that. And so he tries to ally himself with the Soviet Union, who says they'll help him because the West and the U.S. and other countries are not going to help him. And the U.S. goes, well, hey, that's you don't want to ally yourself with them, and that's a bad thing for us. So they lead a coup with Joseph Mobutu taking over, who's very much pro-West, and he sets up his dictatorship and does a lot of things. And while that's going on, Patrice Lumumba gets assassinated after Mobutu takes over. So Congo goes through a dictatorship, and then is a democracy nowadays after Mobutu died, but it's still kind of unstable, especially in the eastern regions here, where there are some major rebel groups. Then we have South Africa with its independent movement that happened actually before World Wars. The World Wars in 1910, they get their independence, and they get this because the white minority groups of the British settlers and Boers fought for this, said they wanted it, and the Europeans or the British said, yeah, sure, you guys can have your independence, you guys can run the colony. And so they set up the colony, but they set it up with a system called apartheid to make sure that the Africans didn't have a say, because the British settlers and Boers are a very small minority. The majority of the people living in South Africa are Africans. And this apartheid movement separates the two. It says it's kind of like the segregation in the South, but take it up a couple notches, in that Africans can't move around at all. They don't have any rights. They don't have a voice in the government or anything like that. And so the Africans try to mobilize against it and fight against it. And so that's why we have the ANC, the African National Congress, which fights for that equality. However, most of their leaders will be thrown in prison, especially a guy named Nelson Mandela, who becomes one of their major figures. And he's in prison for 27 years. But as soon as apartheid ends, he's released, and he becomes the first African president of South Africa. So South Africa is independent. It had stability because it was led by the white minorities. Not that that couldn't have happened under the Africans, but they made sure it stayed that way up until the 1990s, where they finally end apartheid, which was a really big push by the international community. And then the Africans have taken over, and it's still, I mean, it's still a stable country. It's still doing okay, but there are still problems between the Africans and the whites. There are still some racist issues because you just can't get rid of a racist mentality overnight, or over a decade, or over a couple decades. It takes time to heal those wounds. Now we're going to move out of Africa and start looking at Asia. And so the biggest movement in Asia for decolonization is India. And India had been trying to fight for this since the early 1900s. They won't get their independence until 1947, but it was a major 30-year movement that was a slow transition to allow the Indians to start taking more and more control of their government. It was primarily led by a group called the INC, or the Indian National Congress, and they weren't the most popular group to begin with. They were mostly elites and people of the upper caste, but a new guy steps in called Gandhi, and he has a partner, Nehru, who step in and really promote the group and really do a great job leading peaceful protest movements that go into Gandhi's philosophy of satyagraha, or truth force, which is where you're going to expose the British for their kind of hypocrisies and force them to make a decision. Are you going to violently repress people that are peacefully protesting, which is not going to look good for you and is going to get more people upset in the country to resist you, or are you going to give us more rights and freedoms? And so there are some violent protests, or some violent responses to it, but for the most part, Gandhi will win this battle, and in 1947 they'll gain their independence, mainly because this battle, this fight, appealed to the masses. Not only the way that Gandhi went about it, but also what Gandhi was saying. He wanted to get rid of the caste system. He wanted to bring Muslims and Hindus together. He wanted to really change India from what it was. And these were great ideas, but at the same time, this is also what gets Gandhi assassinated in 1947, 1948, after the independence movement. He gets killed by a extremist Hindu national that thinks Gandhi is going to bring down Hinduism and bring down India. He thought he was bad for it. Now, while the Hindus are primarily fighting with the INC, or working with the INC, the Muslims are also fighting during this time to get that independence. They begin to work together, mainly because of a guy named Muhammad Jinnah, who they both work together to try, or Jinnah and Gandhi will work together to try to bring about the independence of India. However, there's one thing they don't see eye to eye on, and that is Gandhi wants India to be one India, and Jinnah and the Muslims say, no, we can't do that because we are the minority group and we're not going to get a say, and you're not going to necessarily respect our religious values, and so we want our own country. And so this leads us to, in 1947, when they get their independence, India to be partitioned into three parts. Um, one will be, or really it's two parts, but it's three parts. One is India, and that's the main central area here of India, and they become a secular Hindu state that is kind of is a democracy, is the largest democracy or represented democracy in the world, and they've been fairly stable because of that. And then you have it's divided into Pakistan and a West and East Pakistan that are supposed to be united, but West Pakistan doesn't do much to help East Pakistan, and so East Pakistan will break away and become Bangladesh. And Pakistan becomes an Islamic republic with a lot of ties or a lot of ideas, and they're from Islam, and there's a lot of support there from that. But Pakistan has not been as stable as India, and there's been some military dictatorships throughout there, and there hasn't been a lot of democracy actually, or a stable democracy there. And you can think of things like the 1980s with the problem with the Soviets in Afghanistan, with us being in Afghanistan and Al Qaeda and the Taliban going into Pakistan and disrupting things there. Okay, and then Bangladesh broke away on its own because they just didn't get the support. They are also a Muslim majority country, and they've been okay. They've been slowly building themselves up. They're not the most advanced of these countries, but they are. There hasn't been anything terrible other than some natural disasters or anything like that. So this was a great idea, and it's kind of worked. We don't know what would have happened if they actually would have stayed one country and been one giant India, but there are some bad things that happen because of this partition, mainly that 1 million people will die when fleeing their homes, whether they're in India, they're Muslims in India fleeing to Pakistan or Bangladesh, or will become Bangladesh, or if they're Pakistan Hindus fleeing to India. Because there's violence that goes on, it leads to 12 million refugees, and leads to 1 million dying in these transitions here. There's also been a lot of fighting over a region called Kashmir, which Pakistan believes should be should be part of Pakistan, and India says no, it's part of us. And so they've been fighting over that. There have been several wars over that, and it's still a major place of contention in India today. So that hasn't gone away, and that's been because of this partition. And also, they have both developed nuclear weapons because of this, because India had developed nuclear weapons first, so that they could use them against Pakistan if they ever needed to, and then Pakistan found out about that and developed their own, and so they are two of the few nuclear nations in the world because of this divide. Okay, now we've only got a couple more here to look at. We got Vietnam, and then a couple countries in the Middle East we'll take a look at. And Vietnam's kind of pretty simple here. It's led by a guy, or they want their independence from France, and they're led by a guy named Ho Chi Minh, and he wants to bring a communist revolution to Vietnam and bring Vietnam under the make Vietnam a communist state. And he does this by fighting a guerrilla war with the French, and the French lose this war. They work out a peace treaty with Ho Chi Minh and divide Vietnam into North and South Vietnam, similar to what happens in Korea. If you think about what happened in Korea, where the North Koreans attack South Korea, that's the same thing that happens here. North Vietnam attacks South Vietnam to try to unite all of Vietnam, and the U.S. tries to step in, just like in the Korean War, but this one doesn't work out too well. As you might know, the Vietnam War is not a great time for the U.S., and the U.S. will eventually back out of it, and South Vietnam will be conquered by the Vietnamese, or the North Vietnamese, and become a full communist state. And that is still a communist state today, one of the few that are still remaining. Okay, and then if we go to the Middle East, we'll take a look at Turkey here. Turkey was not colonized at all, but was an empire that fell after World War I. They have to try to rebuild themselves, and so they're led by a guy named Mustafa Ataturk, who sets up a secular Islamic state, and they try to follow all the ideals, or many of the ideals of the Europeans, and make themselves almost like a European country with European laws, a westernized alphabet. They industrialize, they give women more rights, they have They are definitely more secular than any other Islamic state in the region, and so um, they they work really hard to become European, and they are still like that today. They are working on trying to become part of the European Union, but the Europeans are not too excited about them being a part of that because most of them are not in Europe and they're in the Middle East, and so they don't kind of want to open that up. But they are trying to be westernized, and uh, there was a little bit of a backlash after Mustafa Ataturk died, but for the most part, that is kind of it didn't lead to any major resurgence of an Islamic state or anything like that, like we'll see here in Iran. And the other country that we'll talk about is Iran, which was a very Western state with the Reza Shah being allied with the U.S., trying to make the country as Western as possible, giving people many, many rights, giving women many rights, um, allowing people to have many freedoms. However, by doing this, he upsets the religious leaders, and they decide to go against the Reza Shah and try to bring down his regime. And so what they do is they're led by a guy named Khomeini, who is the leading Ayatollah, and he starts inciting the people to rebel against the Reza Shah. That leads to him being kicked out of the country and sent to France, where he still incites the people, and the people will eventually rise up and will push the Reza Shah out after he tries to suppress the rebellions. He eventually loses all momentum when he kills some innocent protesters or kills peaceful protesters, and he will leave the country. Khomeini will come back, and he will establish a new Muslim theocratic government that has Republican elements in it. So this government has a republic. There's a president they vote for. They have representatives from regions, but in the end, the Ayatollah has the last say as to what happens in the government. And so that is Khomeini at that time. Now it's a guy named Khamenei, and they can kind of reverse if they say that it goes against the practices of Islam. They can reverse it and change that law or say that law cannot happen. And this led to the new Iranian state reducing the rights of women, forcing them to wear the hijab or some type of head shawl, taking away education opportunities for women and other groups of people, and just making it more of a Islamic state under a Sharia law. And so this kind of brings an end to what we're going to look at for the decolonization movements. As you can kind of see, a common theme throughout all these is that for most of the decolonization countries or decolonizing countries, they aren't helped a whole heck of a lot by their parent countries in setting up a stable economy and setting up a stable government. And so that leads to issues with military coups happening and dictators taking over. But over time, those countries have got better for the most part, and as we get to the more modern days, they are setting up more and more stable representative democracies in countries like Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa. They're all improving. India definitely are all improving and becoming a major, or starting to become players in this world economy.